He spent his life unlocking the secrets of the universe until he created something that could end it. They called him the father of the atomic bomb. But behind that title lived a man haunted by a truth so terrifying, he tried to bury it inside himself. This is the story of a genius who split the atom, and in doing so, split his own soul. For decades, history celebrated him as a hero, a visionary, a man who gave his nation the ultimate weapon, until the day that same nation turned him into the threat. Few people know the hidden chapters of J. Robert Oppenheimer's life, the coded letters, the secret councils, the nights he could not sleep because of the faces he saw every time he closed his eyes. What the world remembers is the light of 1,000 suns. What the world forgets is the shadow it left inside him. The truth is not simple. It never was. Oppenheimer was not just the brilliant mind who led the Manhattan Project. He was a man torn between science and conscience, loyalty and doubt, creation and destruction. And in that tension, in that impossible duality, something inside him began to break. For 30 years, a classified file bearing his name sat untouched inside a locked cabinet in Washington. A file that painted him not as a savior, but as a risk, a danger, a man who knew too much and regretted it even more. He spent years fearing a bomb he didn't build. No one told the world what Oppenheimer tried to stop. No one told them what he saw coming. And no one dared to speak of the night he realized that the weapon he believed would end all wars would only be the beginning of something far darker. To understand Oppenheimer is to walk straight into the paradox of genius. How a man can save millions by creating a machine built to kill them. And yet, beneath the public triumph, beneath the cheers and newspaper headlines, he felt something else rising behind him. A specter made of fire, fallout, and guilt. A creation that followed him everywhere he went. Some say he feared the bomb. Others say he feared himself. Before Los Alamos, before the test on that quiet desert morning, before the blinding flash that changed the world, there was a young man with a brilliant mind, fragile, restless, desperate to understand a universe that felt too vast for any one life. He did not yet know the path he was walking, and he could not see the shadow he would one day cast across history. This is not the story of the bomb. This is the story of the man who built it, and the darkness that built him. He was born into a world of quiet privilege, a child surrounded by books, ideas, and expectations too heavy for small shoulders. Even then, he felt it, that uneasy sense that the universe was whispering secrets just beyond his reach. As a boy, he would stare at the stars for hours, refusing to blink as if he feared the night might take them away. His parents thought it was curiosity, but inside him, something deeper was already forming. A hunger not just to learn, but to understand everything. He read faster than his teachers could teach. He solved problems before they finished writing them on the board. And yet, he never felt ahead. He felt chased. By what he could not explain. Some called him brilliant. Others called him strange. But those closest to him saw something else. A loneliness that brilliance could not hide. He once wrote to a friend, "I need physics more than friends. Physics is where I find peace." But physics did not give him peace. It gave him questions. Questions that pressed against the edges of his mind like a storm waiting to break. By the time he reached his early 20s, His mind was already operating in realms few dared to imagine. He saw equations as landscapes, and the atom as a world with its own hidden geography. Yet behind that expanding mental universe, there was a darker truth. The more he understood, the more fragile he felt. Knowledge did not make him stronger. It made him aware of how easily everything, matter, life, sanity, could fall apart. His professors admired him. His peers feared him. He was intense, unpredictable, and at times consumed by thoughts he could not escape. One colleague recalled the way Oppenheimer would whisper solutions under his breath, as if he were afraid someone, or something, might hear them first. But beneath that brilliance simmered a silent turmoil. There were nights he could not sleep, nights when his mind spiraled so violently he would walk until dawn just to feel the world beneath his feet. He was a young man searching for meaning and finding only deeper questions. Then, one day, standing alone in a cramped lecture room, staring at a chalkboard filled with symbols that looked like a language no human should understand, he felt something shift inside him, a realization that would follow him for the rest of his life. If knowledge could illuminate the world, it could just as easily burn it down. He did not know it then, but he was walking toward a moment that would scar the century. Every question he asked, every equation he solved, every door he opened in the hidden architecture of reality was leading him to the place where discovery ends and consequence begins. And somewhere, far beyond what any young scientist could imagine, the shadow of that future was already forming, waiting for him. Years before the world knew his name, Oppenheimer found himself standing at a crossroads he could not yet see. He believed physics was a sanctuary, a place where truth lived untouched by politics, ambition, or war. But he was wrong. Truth is never untouched, and genius never walks alone. He arrived at Berkeley with a mind sharper than ever, and a loneliness just as deep. Students followed him, not because they understood him, but because they sensed something electric beneath his calm exterior, a storm gathering its strength. He spoke of quantum mechanics as if it were poetry. He turned equations into stories, and the more he taught, the more people saw that his brilliance was not cold or mechanical. It was alive. It flickered in his eyes. It weighed on his shoulders. But with that brilliance came a growing unrest. He saw political ideologies ripping across Europe like wildfire. He saw persecution, fear, and the weaponization of ignorance. And deep down, he felt the world changing, shifting into something that could no longer be solved on a chalkboard. He was a scientist, but he was also a man living in a world on the brink of catastrophe. And every headline, every radio broadcast, every rumor of war pushed him further toward a truth he did not want to face. Knowledge could no longer remain separate from power. He began attending political meetings, not out of loyalty to any cause, but out of desperation to understand what humanity was becoming. Friends whispered that he was drifting toward danger. Enemies whispered that he already lived there. Still, there was something admirable and tragic in the way he tried to reconcile the world of ideas with the world of consequences. He wanted to believe that intellect could guide morality. But every year, every crisis, every invasion overseas made that belief harder to defend. In private moments, he wondered whether science was advancing faster than humanity's ability to control it, whether the mind, outrunning the heart, was the most dangerous force in the universe. He pushed the thought away. He had research to do, students to guide, papers to publish. There was comfort in the work, a rhythm he could hide inside. But history does not wait for comfort, and genius does not get to choose the moment it is claimed. One evening, as Oppenheimer walked alone through the quiet Berkeley campus, a colleague approached him with a request that would alter not only his life, but the destiny of the world. A request to meet with men who were assembling a team for a project that did not yet have a name, only a purpose. A purpose whispered in hushed tones, to unlock the power hidden inside the heart of the atom. He did not yet know where this road would lead, but when he agreed to that conversation, something shifted in the fabric of history. The world was moving toward an irreversible threshold, and Oppenheimer was now moving with it. He arrived at the meeting without knowing what he was truly walking into. A room filled with men who did not speak loudly, because the weight of their intentions spoke for them. They told him the world was changing faster than anyone could control, that Europe was on fire, that brilliant minds were being silenced, exiled, erased, and buried beneath those horrors was a rumor they could no longer ignore. Germany might be close to unlocking the energy inside the atom. If they succeeded first, civilization itself could end in the hands of a regime built on hatred. Oppenheimer listened, his hands still, his mind racing. What they were asking him to consider was not just a scientific pursuit, but a race for humanity's survival. The idea struck him with equal parts fascination and dread. For years he had imagined what might be possible if the atom were split deliberately, cleanly, controlled. But he also understood the truth few dared to say aloud. The power inside the atom was not like any other discovery. It was a force that did not care who controlled it. They asked him to lead a team, a theoretical division, a group of physicists capable of calculating the unthinkable. He hesitated, not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of success. He had spent his life chasing the deepest truths of the universe. Now the universe was asking him a question in return. What would he do with the truth once he found it? He agreed, quietly, almost reluctantly, as if he sensed that this choice would carve itself into the bones of history. Within months, he was appointed scientific director of a project so secret that even its architects barely understood its scope. A project tucked away in a barren stretch of New Mexico desert, a place that would soon be known as Los Alamos. The land was empty, windswept, quiet enough to hear your own conscience. Scientists arrived with suitcases, military escorts, and a sense that they were stepping out of the world and into something that did not yet have a name. They brought their families, their fears, their brilliance. And under Oppenheimer's watchful eye, they built a town from dust and ambition. A place where playgrounds stood next to laboratories, where laughter echoed in the same air as classified secrets. But even in those early days, those who knew Oppenheimer sensed a tension inside him, a quiet gravity, as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff only he could see. He carried notebooks filled with equations that looked less like mathematics and more like prophecy. He walked through the labs at night, checking instruments, revisiting calculations, trying to convince himself that they were building something history would one day forgive. The team worked with breathtaking speed, not because they were fearless, but because they were afraid. They believed a darker shadow was gathering across the world, and that they were racing it. Oppenheimer pushed them forward, inspired them, challenged them. But inside him, doubt was already beginning to bloom. At night, he wondered whether the line between salvation and destruction was thinner than a sheet of paper, and whether they were crossing it without realizing how far they had gone. As the months passed, the laboratories of Los Alamos began to hum with a strange, feverish energy. Ideas sparked like electricity. Arguments erupted and dissolved just as quickly. Sleep became optional. Hope and dread lived in the same rooms. The world outside was burning, but inside the fences of the desert, a different kind of fire was being built, one that only a handful of people truly understood. And at the center of it all was Oppenheimer. Walking from building to building, a cigarette in one hand, equations swirling in his mind like storms he could not escape. He inspired devotion. He commanded respect. But those closest to him noticed something shifting, a heaviness behind the eyes, a silence that seemed to grow with every breakthrough. The team celebrated small victories, a calculation solved, a new material tested, a design flaw corrected. But each success only tightened the knot in Oppenheimer's chest. He knew what they were building. He understood it more deeply than anyone. He could feel its shape forming in the dark corners of his mind. A machine not of steel and wires, but of irreversible consequences. At night he would stand outside, staring at the New Mexico sky, trying to quiet a growing fear. A fear that, once unleashed, the power they were unlocking would never return to its cage. He saw his colleagues changing too. Some became exhilarated, drunk on possibility. Others grew pale and withdrawn, as if they could sense history breathing down their necks. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. They were building something that did not belong to the world as it was. Conversations in the dining hall grew shorter. Laughter sounded forced. Some scientists avoided looking at their own children, as if ashamed of the world they might soon inherit. One evening, a young researcher approached Oppenheimer with trembling hands. He asked a question no one had dared to ask. What if we succeed? Oppenheimer didn't answer. He simply looked away, his silence heavier than any reply. He was beginning to feel trapped between responsibility and inevitability, between the brilliance that brought him here and the consequences that waited ahead. He once believed science could rise above politics. He now saw how naive that dream had been. Their work was no longer pure. It was chained to fear, to rivalry, to a world desperate to control something it did not yet understand. And still, the project pushed forward. Every calculation brought them closer. Every test narrowed the path. Every day, the shadow grew longer. The scientists whispered among themselves about a theoretical possibility, a terrifying chance that the detonation might ignite the atmosphere, that the sky could burn, and the world beneath it with it. Some laughed it off. Others couldn't sleep because of it. Oppenheimer held both truths at once. He knew the odds were low, but he also knew that low was not the same as impossible. And as that thought settled deeper into him, a new fear took shape, not of the enemy abroad, but of what humanity might become with a weapon like this in its hands. Something inside him cracked, not loudly, but quietly, like a fault line shifting beneath the earth. The bomb was becoming real, and so was the cost. The desert was silent the night before the test, a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as if the world itself sensed what was coming. For months, Los Alamos had lived in a relentless storm of equations, wiring, failures, and breakthroughs. But now, on the eve of the Trinity test, the pace suddenly slowed. People spoke in softer voices. They walked with the uneasy calm of those approaching a threshold they could not turn back from. Oppenheimer wandered alone through the camp, the cold sand shifting softly beneath his feet. He could see the shape of the tower in the distance, dark, skeletal, waiting. Inside it rested the device, their creation, their burden. He had imagined this moment for years, but the reality felt heavier than anything his mind could predict. The bomb was no longer theory, no longer numbers on a chalkboard. It was here, real, assembled, alive in its own way. Some of the scientists gathered in small groups, making nervous jokes, trying to chase away the feeling that they were about to witness something no human should ever see. Others wrote letters to their families, just in case the dawn never came. A few could not sleep at all. They sat at their desks, staring at blank pages, haunted by the same question that had followed Oppenheimer for months. What if this changes everything? He knew the answer. It wouldn't change everything. It would end one world and begin another. He returned to his room, but the bed felt foreign, too soft, too ordinary for the weight he carried. He sat by the window instead, watching the desert breathe in long, slow waves beneath the moon. His thoughts drifted to the scientists who had followed him here, brilliant minds he admired, young students he had mentored, fathers, mothers, dreamers, people who believed they were building a weapon to save the world, not break it. He felt responsible for each of them, for their choices, their fears, their unspoken doubts, and for the future that waited just beyond dawn. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the desert wind. He inhaled slowly, hoping the smoke might quiet the trembling inside him. It didn't. He replayed calculations in his mind, every line, every constant, every assumption. He wanted certainty, but certainty was a luxury no one had at the edge of creation. Someone knocked lightly on his door, a colleague, eyes tired, voice thin. "Robert, do you think it will work?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the man, saw the hope and fear knotted together behind his eyes, and replied quietly, "It will work. That's what scares me." The colleague left. Oppenheimer remained still, feeling the truth of his own words settle like ash in his chest. Outside, the sky began to darken toward morning, a deep, unsettling blue, as if the night itself was refusing to leave. In a few hours, humanity would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. A line Oppenheimer himself had drawn without meaning to. He stood, straightened his coat, and stepped outside into the cold air. Each breath felt heavier, as though the future was pressing down on him. The test would begin at dawn, and with it, the world Oppenheimer knew would end. The desert was still when the scientists gathered before dawn, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. No one spoke. No one needed to. Everything that could be calculated had been calculated. Everything that could be feared had already taken root inside them. They stood facing the tower, a dark silhouette against the horizon, holding the device that had consumed their minds, their time, their sleep, their innocence. Some whispered prayers. Others clenched their fists. Oppenheimer stood apart, silent, his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed on the point where night would soon surrender to dawn. A faint countdown began, soft, steady,
inevitable.
Each number dropped into the air like a stone sinking into deep water. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a breath held by the earth itself. And then, light. A light so violent it shattered the darkness, turning night into day, and day into something unrecognizable. It rose faster than thought, brighter than anything human eyes were meant to see. Heat swept across the desert in a silent wave. Sand turned to glass. Shadows evaporated. The scientists threw their arms over their faces, some in awe, some in terror, some unable to comprehend that what they saw was no longer theory, but reality. Oppenheimer did not look away. He stood unmoving, his eyes locked on the expanding fireball as it billowed upward like a newborn sun. It reflected in his glasses, two burning worlds staring back at him. He felt wonder. He felt horror. He felt the weight of 1,000 futures collapsing into this single instant. There are moments when a man sees too much and understands it. This was one of them. The shock wave arrived last, rolling across the desert like the roar of an ancient beast awakened from sleep. It hit their bodies, their chests, their bones, and something inside Oppenheimer trembled with it. He opened his mouth, and a single thought rose from somewhere deep within him, a place older than science, older than fear. A line he had read in a sacred text long before this day, never imagining he would one day embody its meaning. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. When the fire finally began to fade, the silence that followed felt heavier than the blast. No cheering, no celebration. Only the quiet understanding that the world had just stepped into a new and uncertain age, an age they had ushered in. The men removed their goggles, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Some realized suddenly they were crying. Others felt nothing at all. Oppenheimer turned away from the dying glow in the sky. He walked slowly, as if returning from somewhere far beyond the desert. Those who saw him that morning noticed something different in his posture, a weight that had not been there the day before. The test had succeeded, but success felt like ruin. He whispered to a colleague beside him, his voice thin and breaking under the truth. Now we are all sons of bitches. The bomb had worked. The world would never be the same, and neither would he. When news of the bomb reached the world, the reaction was not silence, but thunder. Newspapers hailed him, politicians praised him, crowds celebrated a weapon they barely understood. For a moment, Oppenheimer stood in the glow of victory, a glow almost as blinding as Trinity itself. But light always casts a shadow, and his was growing. He traveled to Washington, surrounded by applause, yet feeling more alone than ever. Every handshake felt heavier, every speech stranger. He watched people honor the bomb, the way one might honor a god, without grasping the price it demanded. He gave interviews, spoke at ceremonies, stood beside world leaders, but behind every word lived a truth he could no longer ignore. They had unleashed something no nation should ever hold. At night, he began to dream in flashes, the light, the fire, the expanding sphere of destruction. He would wake gasping, unsure whether the world outside his window was still intact. While the public celebrated him, Oppenheimer started speaking out, quietly at first, then louder, about the dangers of this new age. He urged restraint, He urged caution. He urged humanity not to follow the bomb with something even worse. But the men in power had no patience for caution. They had seen what the bomb could do. They wanted more. He opposed the hydrogen bomb. He warned it would not protect the world. It would fracture it. He argued for international control, for a world united in preventing its own destruction. To some, he sounded wise. To others, he sounded dangerous. Whispers began to form behind closed doors. Old acquaintances resurfaced. Past associations, political meetings, casual friendships, brief ideological curiosities from decades earlier were twisted, distorted, and weaponized against him. Powerful people started asking a new question. If he regretted the bomb, could he still be trusted? Soon, the man who had once been a national hero was called to testify again and again. Interrogations, hearings, accusations delivered with polite smiles. He felt the temperature around him change, not suddenly, but slowly, like a room filling with smoke. He tried to defend himself. He tried to explain that he was not loyal to any ideology, only to the survival of humanity. But in the fever of the Cold War, nuance was the first casualty. They stripped him of clearance. They stripped him of influence. They stripped him of the very trust he had sacrificed everything to earn. When the verdict came, even those who disliked him were stunned by its cruelty. It was not a trial. It was an erasure. A colleague later said, "They didn't just take away his clearance. They broke his spirit." Oppenheimer left Washington with a hollow ache in his chest, one he could not hide, one he could not name. He had faced the fire of Trinity and survived. But this felt different. He began to understand something tragic. The bomb had not destroyed him, but the world's reaction to it just might. There is a cruelty in human history, how quickly we turn our heroes into warnings. And now, as Oppenheimer walked away from the halls of power, he realized he had become both. In the years that followed his fall from grace, Oppenheimer became a quieter figure, not forgotten, but displaced, like a monument moved from the public square to a room no one entered anymore. He accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a place where minds wandered freely and ideas grew without the weight of politics. But even there, among some of the greatest thinkers of the century, he carried an invisible burden. People greeted him warmly. They admired him. They respected him. Yet beneath every conversation lay the unspoken truth everyone knew. This was the man who had opened a door the world could never close again. He lectured, he wrote, he traveled. Outwardly, he lived a normal intellectual life. But those who watched closely saw the heaviness in his gestures, the way his gaze drifted, as if he were always listening for something only he could hear. He began to age faster than his years. His shoulders curved. His voice softened. There were days when he seemed far away, as if some part of him still stood in the New Mexico desert, watching the sky ignite. He smoked constantly. He paused often. His smiles came slower, and his silences grew longer. Those close to him said he carried two versions of himself. The brilliant young physicist who once believed knowledge would save the world, and the older man who understood, far too late, that knowledge without wisdom is its own kind of destruction. But despite everything, despite the hearings, the accusations, the exile, he never abandoned his hope that humanity might choose restraint. He advocated for arms control, for cooperation between nations, for a future that did not depend on fear. Some listened, most did not. The world was moving toward a new age of nuclear rivalry, and Oppenheimer's voice, once powerful, once feared, now sounded more like a warning spoken into the wind. Yet even then, even as he watched nations build arsenals of fire from the science he had pioneered, he did not turn bitter. He turned inward, reflective, gentle even, as if he understood that punishment would not come from governments, but from memory. Near the end of his life, he gave a rare interview. His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. "We knew the world would not be the same," he said. Some laughed, some cried. Most were silent. Silence. That was the legacy he felt most deeply. Not applause, not condemnation, just the silence that follows a revelation so immense that humanity can only stand before it and hope it survives itself. His health began to fail. Cancer, the slow fire, came for him quietly. Friends visited him during those final days and found a man who no longer carried anger, only acceptance. A colleague once asked him, "Do you regret what you created?" Oppenheimer looked at the man for a long moment, his eyes hollow but calm, and answered, "I regret that we could not control what it became." On February 18, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer finally closed his eyes. Those who knew him said he looked peaceful, as if the weight he had carried for decades had finally loosened its grip. But history does not let go so easily. His name remains etched into the bones of the world. His legacy burns in every reactor, every missile silo, every uneasy treaty signed in the shadow of the atom. He changed the world, and the world changed him. Not with glory, not with triumph, but with a question humanity still struggles to answer. What does it mean to create something we cannot control? History remembers Oppenheimer as the man who split the atom. But that is only half the truth. The other half lives in the silence that followed, the silence he carried until his final breath. He believed knowledge was a light, a gift, a way to understand the world and our place within it. But the deeper he looked, the more he realized that some truths do not illuminate. They burn. The power he helped unleash reshaped nations, rewrote borders, and placed the future of humanity into the fragile hands of fear and ambition. He spent the rest of his life trying to warn the world that what they celebrated was not victory, but a threshold, a point of no return. And yet, even in his despair, there was something profoundly human in him, a longing for redemption, not in the eyes of governments or history books, but in the possibility that somewhere, someday, humanity might learn to wield its power without destroying itself. In his private writings, he hinted at a truth he never spoke aloud, that genius is not the ability to understand the universe, but the courage to confront what that understanding reveals. Oppenheimer confronted more than equations. He confronted the darkest reflection of human potential. And that reflection stayed with him, a companion he never escaped. Some say he was a tragic figure. Others say he was a warning. But perhaps he was something more. A reminder that the greatest dangers we face are not the forces of nature, but the forces we awaken within ourselves. The world he left behind is shaped by his brilliance, scarred by his creation, and haunted by the question he never stopped asking: what do we become when our power grows faster than our wisdom? There are no easy answers. There never were. But his life, in all its triumph and torment, whispers a final truth: that greatness is never pure, and genius always casts a shadow. And in the glow of that terrible light, the one born in the desert at dawn, the one that changed everything, we are still searching for a way to live with the fire we created. Oppenheimer is gone, but the world he revealed is ours to face. This is the legacy he left behind, a question that endures, echoing across time, asking us not just what we have made, but what we will choose to become. This is his shadow, and it is now ours.